With us today, Dr. Silke Appel-Cresswell. She's a movement disorder neurologist and associate professor for medicine and neurology at the University of UBC. She holds the Marg Meikle Professorship for research in Parkinson's disease and directs the Pacific Parkinson's Research Center at UBC. Her research focuses on the role of the microbiome in Parkinson's disease and other brain disorders, nutrition and other lifestyle interventions, as well as non-motor symptoms of Parkinson's. She's the founding director of the BC Brain Wellness Program and has previously served as the president of the Canadian Movement Disorder Society and the director of the Canadian Residence Course for Movement Disorders. She's the recipient of a 2022-23 UBC Killam Teaching Award. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cresswell.
Good morning. Lovely to see you all here. Yeah, and thank you for the introduction, Jean. I'm talking about cognition today, and I actually have to go and share my slides here for starters. So let me just get that going. Bear with me here. And I'm going to share, let's see, this screen. Hi. All right, can you see the screen okay?
Yes.
Perfect. So, yeah, so I'm talking about cognition, and it's going to be a bit of an emphasis on a diet, because that has been slightly neglected before. We've heard a lot about exercise, which is obviously absolutely crucial, but diet has not made much of an appearance, and I think this is becoming increasingly clear how important this actually is. To start with, I humbly and gratefully acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'll jump right in here, looking at what we actually talk about when we talk about cognition. It's a term that is used in the clinic, but it might be a bit nebulous at times. These cognitive functions, also called cognitive domains, that we're mostly concerned about in Parkinson's are executive function. So this is things like mental flexibility, planning future action, particularly if it has several steps, organizing things, solving problems. So everything we need in everyday life to make our life work. And then there's attention, and attention, of course, so you might want to say maybe concentration. Attention is necessary for any of the cognitive functions we do. So it always plays a role. Memory is important, and visual spatial abilities. Language is not so much of an issue usually in Parkinson's. It can be later on, but it usually is quite well preserved. And so what does that actually mean in everyday life? So what could be difficult? Could be things like multitasking, as I said, problem solving, decision making. Could be things like organizing medications, particularly when they get really complex and have several different medications at different times. Keeping appointments, following complex instructions, being that assembling something, the IKEA instructions, or cooking a meal, switching the stove or the water off. Using a computer or learning a new program, particularly using a smartphone, can sometimes be more challenging. Thinking quickly on your feet, driving, of course, which is the epitome of multitasking, doing physical activity, thinking about it, reacting quickly. But it can also be things like train of thought or following and participating, particularly in a conversation. And what is really important is that these difficulties or abilities can actually fluctuate over the course of the day, and sometimes they are good days and sometimes they are bad days. And so it's really important to acknowledge that if somebody can do something in the morning, but this is a real challenge in the afternoon, this does not mean that this is being put on, but this is just being part of how our brain works. Other factors are influencing what you can do. There are also behavioral issues that can sometimes come with cognitive decline. So those are things like apathy, so a lack of interest and motivation. It's really difficult to get off the couch and actually start doing something. You might not be quite as interested in friends, family, previous hobbies. There can be mood changes, even personality changes. Hallucinations can occur when there's cognitive decline, and excessive daytime sleepiness, so taking more naps during the day. And the important thing really is, and that's why we're talking about it today, what is the impact? The impact is quite significant. It's a major impact on quality of life for both the person living with Parkinson's as well as the care partners. And there can be an economic impact just because it can interfere with the ability to work, of course, but it can also mean that care requirements are going up, which then, of course, again, has an economic impact. When we talk about this, and if you go into the literature or if you're in the clinic, there are certain terms that are being used. So there is subjective cognitive decline. That's a term that was really developed in the Alzheimer's world, but is starting to be used more in the Parkinson's world as well. So this is really a self-perceived cognitive decline. If you do a cognitive test, performance is normal, nothing that other people necessarily that you can measure, but it is maybe, okay, words don't come quite as quickly as they used to. It just takes more effort to think, that sort of thing. Then there's mild cognitive impairment. That refers to a gradual decline in cognitive ability. There might be some deficits on cognitive testing, and that might be in one domain, or it might be in several domains. There might be subtle difficulties in everyday life, but overall, people live the life they've lived before. And then there's Parkinson's disease dementia. And dementia, that term really means that there are significant difficulties in everyday life. So what a person can do really changes because of the cognitive problems. And this can go many ways. So this is the red line is the time of the diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. And then at that point already, there can be normal cognition, so everything is normal. There can be subjective cognitive decline. There could be early mild cognitive impairment or mild cognitive impairment. There could already be dementia at that point. If that is the case, we usually talk about this as dementia with Lewy bodies. And then afterwards, over the years, either cognition stays normal or there's some very minimal cognitive decline, or there can be mild cognitive impairment. This can, as this dotted line shows here, fluctuate, or that it can progress either more slowly or more rapidly to dementia. But it could also be normal for many, many years or forever. And when we look at what happens at the level of the brain and what are risk factors for cognitive decline, so anybody who's older at the age of diagnosis already or has grown older over the course of the disease is at higher risk. Male sex is a risk factor. Acting out of dreams or REM sleep behavior disorder is a risk factor. And then there are genetic factors. So a GBA mutation, an alpha-synuclein mutation, ApoE4, which again comes mostly from the Alzheimer's world, but has been recognized to play a role in risk of cognitive decline in Parkinson's as well. And then when we look at the pathology, so when you look at the brain under the microscope, a good half of people that have just alpha-synuclein, so Parkinson's typical pathology, that the alpha-synuclein is the protein that clamps up in Parkinson's, so very typical findings for Parkinson's. A few might also have what is called beta amyloid, which is usually found in Alzheimer's, but it isn't enough on its own to make an Alzheimer's diagnosis. And then about a third of people who have dementia and where the brains are examined under the microscope after their passing have both beta amyloid and tau pathology, which would make the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease in addition to Parkinson's. So there's some overlap, but the vast majority is really caused by Parkinson's pathology. But there's some overlap with Alzheimer's. And I think that reminds us that it's really important to also learn from the field of Alzheimer's disease when we talk about Parkinson's. And a lot of the suggestions and strategies I'm going to present today are actually really coming out of the Alzheimer's field, because they haven't been tested in Parkinson's, the studies haven't been done, but there are good strategies with very low or no risk associated with them, and so they should be pursued, and they might have evidence in the field of Alzheimer's. And I'm staying with that actually, because in Alzheimer's, the description of risk factors is actually quite well done. And physical inactivity, and we already heard about exercise quite a bit in the rewards, and it's absolutely inspiring to see that there are so many role models of people out there who really take this seriously, and they exercise, and that is really that's one of the foundations of living well, and certainly living well with any brain condition. So physical inactivity is a risk factor for dementia, so exercise and being active in everyday life is really key. Smoking, fortunately, people with Parkinson's usually don't smoke that much, but smoking is a risk factor for dementia, as is excessive alcohol consumption. Air pollution, infrequent social contact, so social isolation is a real problem. Obesity is a risk factor for dementia. Hearing impairment, and I should also add visual impairment. Depression is a risk factor. Diabetes, high blood pressure, which is often not a problem in Parkinson's anymore, but before Parkinson's happens, it can be. Less education, but this also refers to ongoing cognitive activities and head injuries. So all of that is relevant in Parkinson's probably as well. And what is interesting to me, again, this is the accepted kind of list of risk factors and estimates of how much of those risk factors are, they are modifiable. And the estimates range from the low estimate would be like a third of risk factors for dementia are modifiable, but this goes as high as 60% of risk factors for dementia are modifiable. And what isn't mentioned here, but plays a role in, for example, obesity or diabetes, is diet, is nutrition. And I think that will change quite soon, because it has to be included. And then in addition to these risk factors and underlying pathology, there's of course an influence on other Parkinson's symptoms, but also other medical conditions that can influence cognitive performance on a given day. So depression and anxiety already heard. So if you're really anxious and you're very nervous about a situation, very difficult to think straight, right? Or to give a coherent answer. And we all know that if we're very anxious, we're certainly not at our best. If we're very fatigued, if we feel just worn out, our brain is equally worn out. If we can't sleep at night, that has a major impact the next day. Particularly to mention also obstructive sleep apnea. So where there's a blockage of the airway that then leads to pauses in breathing at night, and you might then wake up, gasp for air, snore. So that's usually or very often something that the bed partner says, or it might come up with a headache and just feeling exhausted the next morning. If you're too high or too low with the dopamine levels, that can of course play a role as well. So being off certainly has an effect on cognitive function, but also having too much levodopa on board. So there might be dyskinesias that are obvious, but it could also be that thinking is really driven. It is fleeting from topic to topic. There might be excessive talking or writing. So both under and over medications are detrimental to cognitive function. And there's really a sweet spot that we need to hit. Sedating medications, anticholinergic medications. So those are, for example, things like Gravol, things you can get over the counter in the pharmacy, can be detrimental to cognitive function. Low vitamin B12 levels, low vitamin D levels are both associated with poorer cognitive function. So that is certainly something to look into, as is low thyroid function. Those are all blood tests that can be done. And of course, any other medical condition. If you're sick, then, when we're sick, we're not performing well. So those can all be addressed. Really important to take a holistic view. I should also add orthostatic hypotension. So this is low blood pressure on standing, can also have an effect on cognitive function in Parkinson's. So how do we manage this? Obviously, and I just said it, they need to be addressed. Make sure you're talking to your medical team, treat depression, anxiety, treat sleep apnea. So for example, with a CPAP machine, avoid sedatives, avoid polypharmacy as much as that is possible. Have things like vitamin B12 checked out and replaced if needed. Have good control of high blood pressure, but also don't go too low. That is more of a problem in Parkinson's. Addressing hearing and vision problems. We don't have the definitive answer yet whether hearing loss in itself is just a risk factor for dementia, or whether wearing hearing aids, using hearing aids, so addressing the hearing issues will also improve then cognition. I would err on the latter side and address the hearing issues, because it also is really important for social interactions. And then, as I said, getting the dopaminergic medications right is really important. And generally speaking, if there is a situation where there is cognitive impairment, then we really need to try and simplify the levodopa and the dopaminergic medication. So we'll peel away medications that are add-ons in Parkinson's, and often just end up with levodopa only as the only medication that we use in that situation, because it has the by far best benefit side effect ratio here. What about medications specifically for cognitive difficulties? So there are no medications to slow down or reverse cognitive decline at this point, which is true for the whole of Parkinson's, all working hard on changing that. And for mild cognitive impairments, we also don't have any specific medications. Previous trials into, for example, cholinesterase inhibitors, rasagiline, etc., they have not been successful. There are medications for the symptomatic treatment of dementia in Parkinson's, though, and I would say those trials into cholinesterase inhibitors, so those are rivastigmine, donepezil. The olanzapine doesn't actually have a trial in Parkinson's, but it's the same group. They showed a statistically significant effect, but clinically, I'd say somewhat limited if you look at everybody. Having said that, as with anything, and we're moving more towards personalized medicine, there are some people who really benefit and others who don't. And the benefit sometimes is just keeping the current status quo, not necessarily a real improvement, but keeping the status quo to allow somebody to live at home for longer, for example. Another add-on option, and the cholinesterase inhibitors, or rivastigmine or donepezil, can be combined with memantine. Memantine is usually used in more moderate to severe stages of dementia. And again, I would say there are some people who really respond well to it, and for others, it doesn't really do very much. And so again, it comes down to looking at personalized risk profiles and responses, and then making that choice together with your medical team. There are fortunately several ongoing studies, although we certainly need more research. So watch this space, and I'm hoping that at some point we'll have more options. Now, I'll briefly talk about exercise, and my brevity has nothing to do with that. I don't think it's not important, because I think it is absolutely crucial, and I think everybody knows this by now, that we all have to exercise. If you have Parkinson's or are at risk of it, even more important, I say to my patients usually, this is your new job. You got to do exercise. You got to become a semi-professional athlete. And there is evidence for both aerobic, so bringing your heart rate up, as well as resistance training. Best a combination, best something that really also practices moves that are useful in everyday life, including getting off the floor, getting down on the floor, lifting things, etc. If you combine that with cognitive training, so dual tasking, this seems to have a particularly positive effect on ability to dual task, so this executive function piece. And there is, with the different programs, and that is of course always the tricky bit with testing some studies into Parkinson's exercise programs, is that there are so many exercise programs, you know, the duration of the program, the intensity, the frequency of the program, what exactly is done in the program, all of that differs from trial to trial to trial. So it's very difficult to standardize. But to summarize that, there has been evidence for improvements in global cognition, executive function, processing speed, attention, mental flexibility, memory. So you can't go wrong. Obviously, do it in a safe way. Our physiotherapist, Sally Stelling, says what doesn't challenge you doesn't change you. So very much in favor of higher intensity. And there's certainly evidence to support that as well, as long as it is safe. So go for it, essentially. And I'll come back to exercise in a little bit as well. And then, of course, staying active across all these fundamental areas of life is really important. You know, you could say use it or lose it. What you practice, you'll get better at. If you practice playing piano, you'll get better at playing piano. If all you do in exercise is walk around the block, then you won't get better at playing tennis. So you got to practice what you want to be good at. And so spread it across activities, such as cognitive activities. Find things you enjoy. You know, if it ties in with your hobbies, hobbies are great. You know, it could be anything from reading a book or watching a movie and discussing that. It could be learning a language, picking up a hobby and continuing to pursue that. Creative pursuits, music, for example, or even combining that with exercise like dance are fantastic. Social activities, taking up a class, meeting a friend, going for coffee, joining a support group, volunteering, a big one, really great. Volunteering is fantastic. There's always the question, what about cognitive training in isolation? What about computer programs? And the evidence currently is mixed. There's some evidence that this can be helpful, and it usually is helpful for the task you're training. So if you do a lot of Sudoku puzzles, you'll get good at Sudoku puzzles. The question is, how does that translate to everyday life? And some programs seem to be better at this than others. I would say, if you're given the choice of doing another Sudoku puzzle or going out for a walk, then I would say definitely fit the walk in there as well. Spread it out. Don't just do one super specialized thing all the time, but really spread it out for everything that we as humans need to function well and to live well. The conclusion of that really is that cognitive impairment is multifactorial. It's all these different risk factors, and the solution is not going to be a kind of linear one strategy only solution, but it's going to be something where we combine different interventions. And I'll get back to that as well, because the research is increasingly supporting that as well. For example, the worldwide finger studies that started in Finland, and then the acronym it comes to finger. And it's a multi-domain intervention in Alzheimer's, not Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, looking at exercise and diet and cognitive training. And that was a really landmark study, because it did show benefits for cognitive decline. So there was a lower risk of cognitive decline. There was better cognitive performance and maintained physical function. And these were all people, I should be clear, it wasn't people who already had Alzheimer's, but people who were at risk of it. Older participants who were at risk of developing Alzheimer's. Many other studies going on now. And interestingly, all in the field of cognitive decline, risk of Alzheimer's, and nothing really big published in Parkinson's there yet. And that is something we want to change as well. We're about to launch the Impact 360 project, which is a research project which we'll run in healthy ages first, but hopefully it's looking, I think, quite good that we can run this in people living with Parkinson's very soon as well. This will also be a combined intervention with mindfulness, exercise, and nutrition. And then we do a very comprehensive set of assessments from the clinical perspective, but also what we call wet biomarkers, so blood markers, fecal samples, brain imaging, body composition with a DEXA scan, etc. So there'll be a very comprehensive study going on. And that brings me to the role of diet, which I said has been really under-recognized, both in the fields of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, but I think is coming to the fore, and I'm convinced you'll hear much more about this in years to come. Diet can be a bit tricky to study just because it's very difficult to blind it. People have to make a complete change often in what they're eating, so you have to kind of somehow make sure they're really eating that. It's difficult to truly measure what somebody has been eating and whether there was a cookie slipped in or not. But it is absolutely crucial. It is the material that we are made of. It is our biggest interaction with the environment. It is literally, it becomes who we are. It's difficult to overstate that. And of course, if I look at a picture like this just before lunch, that's appetizing. If I look at a picture like that just before lunch, not so much. I think this would be like the epitome of the Western diet and its bad choices. I took this picture in a store near you and me, and I might say I was in the checkout line with my blueberries and nuts and olive oil. But this is what you face, and there you are, hungry and probably exhausted, and on this long checkout line, and this is the offering, and I can just see how people just say, okay, let's just give in and eat this. Not a good idea to do this on a regular basis. Because what we really need to do is to avoid the consumption of processed food, fried food, sugary drinks, a lot of red meat, a lot of pastries and sweets, butter, cheese. Not that you can't ever have this, but it just shouldn't be the basis of nutrition. And, to be honest, I find this much more appetizing anyway. This kind of Mediterranean diet, and I'm sure everybody has heard of this, can be also applied to other cultural diets. The principles really are that this isn't just a diet, but it's a lifestyle. It is often eating with other people, is making time for it. It's eating mindfully, enjoying food, eating when you're, when you're actually hungry, rather than eating for completely different reasons like emotional soothing, etc. So be physically active as part of that as well. And then the base of each meal is really fruits and vegetables, is whole grains, is olive oil, beans, nuts, legumes, and seeds, herbs and spices, and then have some fish and seafood, as well as maybe some poultry, but then really moderate, all these other things that I just showed of meats and sweets and processed food, fried foods, etc. Then one of the further developments of the Mediterranean diet is the MIND diet that was specifically developed for people living or at high risk of Alzheimer's disease. That was done by Dr. Morris in Chicago. And the MIND diet is actually very similar to the Mediterranean diet, but it particularly emphasizes green leafy vegetables in addition to all the other vegetables. Berries, really important. We of course have the pleasure of many blueberries here. They are particularly good. And then the rest is really quite similar to what we just saw with the Mediterranean diet, but it's optimized for cognition. And I should say, in the Alzheimer's or cognition world, this has been shown to reduce the risk of cognitive impairment in people who are at risk of cognitive impairment by about 50% during the study follow-up. And to say this in another way, that people who were adhering to the MIND diet more closely were the equivalent of 7.5 years younger than people who were not. So if you want to get younger, and I guess many people want to eat healthily. I'll go, just to mention, I won't go through everything here because I know we're a bit short of time, but there are many different ways how Mediterranean and MIND diets works, and this is anything from decreasing inflammation to decreasing oxidative stress, decreasing DNA damage, having a lot of the micronutrients that we need, like, for example, vitamin B12 and other B vitamins, vitamin C, E, etc. So many different pathways by which this works, which of course is a much better match to this multi-pathway cognitive decline than just taking one particular supplement or so. and it obviously has an effect across our health. So not only by eating well do we reduce our risk of cognitive decline, but we're also reducing our risk of diabetes, hypertension, obesity, bad cholesterol situation, several cancers. So what is there not to like? And several of those are, of course, in themselves risk factor for cognitive decline. I just to highlight a few things here. The Mediterranean diet also has a lot of dietary fiber, which is absolutely crucial to keep our microbiome happy, and that again in turn is crucial to keeping us happy, our gut happy, to prevent leaky gut symptoms, etc. High quality fats like omega-3s and polyunsaturated fats are really important. So the olive oil, the fish, and then all these fantastic colors that we have in the diet, polyphenols that can be antioxidants, anti-inflammatory, etc. It also decreases toxins that can come in from the gut into the circulation. So for example, P-cresol, it's something we have shown as well here. And if you compare this to the traditional kind of Western diet and what I just showed you, which is much, much poorer as a food matrix, they're lacking micronutrients, lots of salts and artificial additives, refined carbohydrates, etc. So driving inflammation, driving poor lipid profiles, poor metabolic profiles. And so in Parkinson's, it turns out adhering to the Mediterranean or the MIND diet, which they're quite similar, I treat them as one here, reduces the risk of developing Parkinson's motor symptoms. It reduces the risk of developing prodromal symptoms. There's a whole set of prodromal symptoms, and that particularly includes constipation, excessive daytime sleepiness, and depression. It reduces eating healthy in midlife, reduces the risk of developing Parkinson's in later life. It is associated with slower disease progression in Parkinson's. It is associated with a later disease onset in Parkinson's, and this is something we showed here as well, where those people who adhere to the MIND diet more closely had the male participants had on average an 8-year later onset of Parkinson's compared to people who didn't adhere to the MIND diet. And for women, it was even 17 years. So if you recall that we don't have any neuroprotective medications in Parkinson's, this is really amazing. It also correlates with less inflammation systemically. Now, what we do really need are interventional trials. We need to put those diets to the test, and that is where the field is lacking right now. We're going to do several of those trials soon. And I'll get back to that at the end. But just to encourage everybody, what, of course, if you already have Parkinson's, is it still worth your while eating healthily, or should you just say, let's go for the cookies? Yeah, and it turns out there was a very interesting study, again, an observational study, but on an incredibly large number of people. This study was published last summer. It's the follow-up study of the health professionals follow-up study and the nurses health study. So overall, well over 100,000 people. They were followed up since the 80s for over 3 decades. And they captured every 4 years, they captured diet and physical activity in addition to a health status. And because they have so many people, and because this was such a long follow-up time, they could even look at mortality, so at the rate of dying in this study, which is about the hardest outcome you can possibly have. And it turns out that over the course of this follow-up period, over 1,200 people actually developed Parkinson's. So nobody had Parkinson's at baseline, but over 1,200 developed it over the course of this very long study. And of those, over 900 died. And so they could look at, okay, who was at risk of dying during this follow-up study? And it turns out that the people who were eating healthily, so this is the top quartile, so they cut the whole cohort into quarters. The top quarter, when the people who are eating healthily after they got the diagnosis of Parkinson's, were more than 40% less likely to die during the follow-up period. The people who were exercising in the top quarter were more than 50% less likely to die. And the people who were in the top quarter for both exercise and a healthy diet were 65% less likely to die. Now, this is really a very strong result. The caveat here is that this is all correlation. So this is an observational trial. You could say, you know, there is the possibility that the people who had the better Parkinson's were also able to eat better, could prepare those meals, were able to exercise. And so maybe there's some reverse causation. And that is always a concern with observational studies, as useful as they are, particularly when you take that many people into account. But that is why we need to do an interventional study to actually prove that going forwards, randomizing people to these interventions. But in the meantime, since there are really no side effects, so there's no downsides, you get health benefits across the board. What is it that we should do? Obviously, there are some key factors in that, and it turns out that whole grains are really important. Nuts and legumes are really important. Flavonoids, so those colors in the food, in the vegetables and fruit, and then low intake of red and processed meats. And as I said, reverse causation cannot be excluded, but there was an accompanying editorial in this very high-ranking journal that said, you just have to recommend a healthy diet and exercise to everybody with Parkinson's and at risk of Parkinson's, and really everybody, because there is nothing to lose and there's potentially so much to gain, which is so empowering, right? I mean, this is something we all can do. So a word about fiber, because it's so important. There's soluble and insoluble fiber. The insoluble fiber we can't, as just the human host can't actually digest, but that is where the microbes come in. And so, of course, my other area of research that I'm very passionate about, and that is very closely related to the diet. The gut microbiota actually digest this fiber, and they make short-chain fatty acids out of it. And that, again, is crucial for brain health, as well as for gut health and to reduce inflammation. It keeps our gut lining healthy, and with that, it reduces the risk of leaky gut syndrome. And leaky gut is low-grade inflammation in the gut, which then also means that bacteria can enter the gut wall, the toxins can enter the circulation. We've shown that in studies in the past. So fiber is really, really absolutely needed. Flavonoids we also talked about. So those are these colors which are antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and antimicrobial properties. And the higher flavonoid intake was actually in itself associated with lower mortality. So essentially, eat your greens, whites, yellows, reds, and purples. Not just your greens, but all of them. Eat the rainbow. A word about the keto diet, since that has been often asked, and yeah, we're running a little bit late, so I'll keep this relatively short. So the principle is there are different levels of keto diet. The principle is that most of the energy comes from fat. Protein is variable amounts, but the important bit is to cut down on the carbohydrates. So just quickly, the typical diet, and I hope you can see my cursor here, consists mostly of carbohydrates, whereas keto diets are much more based on fat intake. Now, why would you say should this be helpful? Well, there are different mechanisms, and the ketogenic diets are used in different diseases. So, for example, otherwise uncontrolled epilepsies in babies, diabetes, it's been quite popular, etc. But why is it of interest in Parkinson's, and why it is of interest in Alzheimer's and cognitive decline, which is obviously what we're talking about today? And this is that, without going into the details here, that the brain cells in both Alzheimer's and very likely in Parkinson's have a problem processing sugar properly as the source of energy making. And the brain is very energy intense. 20 to 25% of all energy we are using is actually used by the brain, although it's obviously not taking up the same amount of tissue. that it's a very, very highly energy dependent organ. But what the brain can do, and what is not affected by neither Alzheimer's nor Parkinson's, is that it can make energy from ketone bodies. And those ketone bodies, not surprisingly, you get from a ketogenic diet. And so from fats, or you can take medium chain triglycerides. And that can then rescue this energy deficit that develops over time. In this case here with Alzheimer's, but this is probably very similar in Parkinson's. And you can rescue this energy deficit because you can just increase the use of ketone bodies. So what about ketogenic diets in Parkinson's? And studies, so far studies have been small, short-term, maximum 8 weeks, and essentially providing a mixed picture, mostly improving non-motor symptoms, urinary symptoms, pain, fatigue, daytime sleepiness, and also cognitive impairment. Overall, there's been a fairly benign adverse effect profile, but I've seen in clinics that some people did this themselves, and although they had really good benefit anecdotally for motor symptoms, there is a risk of driving your cholesterol up if the ketogenic diet is mostly based on bacon and eggs. But that is one of the reasons why there are really more studies needed. We will do one of those studies. We're just recruiting. We're having our first participant come in on Monday. Very excited. And we'll do a trial into the ketogenic diet. If anybody's interested, let me know. And what we're going to do is to do a combined Mediterranean and ketogenic diet. So where these fats are based on healthy fats, mostly plant-derived, to circumvent some of those potential issues. So in conclusion, what about cognition in Parkinson's? It's a major unmet need in Parkinson's to develop better therapies, more targeted therapies. We need more research. We need to do this with a combined approach. We need to address the risk factors for cognitive decline. And as you saw there are many of them. And really drive combined interventions and test those combined interventions. The lifestyle interventions such as diet, along with exercise, proper sleep, stress reduction, are low risk, are empowering for all of us to do ourselves, and they could have a major impact on both individuals as well as societies. They're really the fundamentals of health and need to be, I think, just an integral part of how we practice medicine and of our healthcare system as well. And so just very briefly, just in case you don't know, we have the BC Brain Wellness Program. This was at the launch day in October 2019. Jean was there as well. And we initially were in person, 75 people, then obviously the pandemic hit in March 2020, went online. Now have reached over 2,500 people, have got about 700 people who work with us at any given time, have provided over 3,000 hours of free programming. And for us, because we are of course an academic center doing that, it's the combination, the integration of program delivery, but also educating the next generation of both researchers as well as clinicians. So we have programs with the School of Physiotherapy where the students come through. We have programs with the School of Dietetics and the kinesiologists. So we train a lot of the next generation there. And then, of course, doing the research. There are many different programs, over 25 usually at any given time, exercise classes, expression and creation, care partner classes, special projects. Now, I can go into some of those particular things, but importantly, there are several research programs and trials that are coming. So I talked about the Impact 360 exercise, nutrition, mindfulness intervention study. I talked about the Mediterranean ketogenic diet study, but we're also looking at music to improve apathy in Parkinson's. We've got probiotic studies. The anxiety one just closed. The depression one will start quite soon. And then also at implementation and outcome studies. And I pretty much went over this already. So BC Brain Wellness, you can just go to the website. And with that, I think everybody who's been involved in research, all our funders, which of course includes the Parkinson Society of BC as well, and all my patients and their families who really are the daily inspiration to get out of bed and do the work we do, and really very inspiring what many of you do. And a big thank you to Parkinson's BC as well, because I think you're doing amazing work and are such a source of support, and it's a pleasure to work with you. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Silke. It was amazing. We do have a little bit of time for some questions, and I see there are some in the chat. So let's start with those first of all. So Anne is asking, I'm not sure, is there a decrease once you're in, I'm not sure exactly what you're connecting that to, Anne. She said, is there a decrease once you're in cognitive decline, not just risk decrease? Maybe you can clarify that question, Anne, and we'll move on to Kenji's question. Is there any data to link bilingualism and cognitive decline or disease progression among people with Parkinson's?
Great question, Kenji, and you would know about this. So I'm not aware of it specifically in Parkinson's, but as I said, I think we really need to look elsewhere as well. And generally speaking, bilingualism is actually a protective factor for developing cognitive decline and dementia. Whether this is definitely true in Parkinson's, I'm not sure, but I don't think there was a study done, but it is for generally cognitive decline. So learning languages is a great way to keep your brain trained. And even if you're not bilingual, and if you want to pick up a language now, or you're traveling, maybe you're going to Barcelona for the World Parkinson's Congress, and you want to pick up some Spanish, always a great idea.
And I'll just say I'm going to skip questions that have particular medication queries, because you really do need to check with your own doctor. We have a question here on freezing of fruit and veggies. Does that diminish the fiber?
No, it doesn't. Fiber is exactly the same, doesn't do anything to fiber. In a way, it's actually a really good way to preserve nutrients, because these things are usually frozen very soon after they're being picked. And that preserves vitamin levels, etc. So I personally think, that matching this, eating fruit and vegetables that are in season, that are local, of course, that is always the best, but we don't get blueberries in the midst of winter. So buying frozen blueberries is a great idea. It's also cheaper. So certainly no concerns about frozen fruits and vegetables.
Are there concerns for being on a vegetarian diet?
No, and actually, so it's the verdict is still out a little bit whether a vegetarian diet is or is not associated with lower risk of Parkinson's. It probably is. The only potential concern would be that vitamin B12 is mostly found in animal-based foods. So you want to make sure, if you're eating a vegetarian diet, that you get enough vitamin B12. Now, if you're vegan, that might be more difficult, because in that case, you don't eat eggs and dairy either. But if you're vegetarian, then you can still get that. But in case of that, because vitamin B12 is so important, you can take if people ask me, what to take as a supplement, I'd say a B vitamin, a combination B vitamin supplement, obviously adhering to what it says on the bottle, so don't go overboard with that, is a good idea. And if there are concerns, vitamin B12 and homocysteine, which is related to that, can be measured in blood as well, because sometimes it doesn't quite get into the blood by taking it as a tablet, and you have to take it as an injection. But as long as you take care of that, vegetarian diet can certainly be very good. All our diet should be mostly plant-based. But within a vegetarian diet, also, you can have a vegetarian diet that is then filled with a lot of processed food, so avoid that nonetheless. So it still needs to be a high quality vegetarian diet.
And I'll just ask this question because it's related again to diet. Cooking of vegetables, does it decrease their nutritional value?
Well, It does to a degree. If the vitamin C might go down, etc. Having said that, you have to find a sweet spot between what you like, what is edible. If you have swallowing problems, eating raw celery only is not going to be a good idea. So you have to make a compromise. Cooking methods, of course, can have an impact as well. The longer you cook it, the hotter you cook it, the more of an impact on nutrients it will have. So steaming something will be healthier than frying the same piece of, let's say, vegetable. But should I now eat a completely raw diet? No, I don't think that is necessary either. But there are ways to incorporate more raw foods into the diet as well. And you can have also smoothies, and salads, of course, are great. So there are very tasty ways to doing that, but it doesn't have to be all raw.
Okay. And Leah's asking about chess. Are there any studies that show its effect on cognitive decline?
Well, so I'm not aware of a specific study in Parkinson's and chess. Having said that, I think chess is, of course, a great way to keep your brain going and think strategically, think logically, foster attention, because you really have to concentrate, you have to anticipate, you have to keep several scenarios in your brain, what if, then that. So I think chess is a great way. It's also social, because unless you play it on a computer, I guess. But otherwise you have to at least one more person. So yeah, if you enjoy playing chess, go for it.
And is there more than one type of B12 supplement?
Yeah, they're different. They're also, so there are different types of vitamin B12. There are also combined vitamin B supplements. And so if you don't have a specific concern, then you can just go and get one of those over the counter. But the most important differential between those different how to take vitamin B12 is really the question of whether you take it orally or whether you need it as an injection. Because for some people, if they don't have a particular factor in the stomach which is needed to absorb vitamin B12, if that is not present, you can take as much vitamin B12 orally as you want, and it just doesn't get in, and you might still have low vitamin B12 level. So the important bit is not so much which specific form of vitamin B12 you take orally, but whether you actually absorb it orally. And that is a blood test that can show that if there is a concern.
Terrific. I think we're going to have a copy of your slides, are we, Silke?
Sure. Yeah, happy to send them.
Okay. So people are asking if that will be available. So yes, it will. And usually we'll be able to get those out within a week or so after the presentation. Are there any other questions that people didn't type but would like to ask orally? We have just a couple minutes left for one or two more questions.
I see John Pierce has got his hand raised.
All right, John, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. As a convert to the MIND diet and a participant of the brain wellness program at UBC, I find your work on microbiome particularly fascinating. Mm-hmm. And the part I don't understand is the chemical communication, at least I presume it's chemical, from the gut to the brain, which I understand takes partly by the vagus nerve, which I really don't understand. And I'm curious if you could add a few comments about that.
Yeah, great question. So this is a very hot topic in research right now, and exactly that is what we need to figure out. So we have a lot of correlational studies. We know that the gut microbiome is different. It is more pro-inflammatory and making more toxins in Parkinson's compared to people same age without Parkinson's. What we need to figure out is how the communication exactly works. In animal models, it has been shown that the alpha-synuclein that seems to actually clump up and accumulate in the gut in many people, but also in certain animal models, to start with and then travel to the brain, can do so via the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, for anybody who isn't in the know yet, is really the nerve connection, the super highway between the gut and the brain, and it delivers messages and things like clumped alpha-synuclein both ways. So that's one thing. There was a very interesting study that, or let's put it this way, there are other ways to communicate is via the bloodstream. So for example, we have shown that toxins like P-crystal, for example, which are made by gut bacteria, are seen in higher concentrations in people with Parkinson's, and other studies have shown that the same P-crystal, again coming from gut bacteria, is higher in the cerebrospinal fluid of people with Parkinson's. So toxins can enter the brain coming from the gut microbiome, coming from the gut via bloodstream to the brain. So that would be another way. Then there are sensing nerve ending cells, etc., that can sense chemicals and that can sense and that can send signals directly to the brain. It's a very interesting study. I'm very intrigued by that in animals that looked at exercise, enjoyment of exercise, and they looked at this whether the mice would run for longer voluntarily on the treadmill. And it turned out that there was a direct correlation. I'm just making this really short now, this particular study, which was very complex and beautifully written. There was a direct correlation between what these animals ate and the gut microbiome, which needed to process what they were eating. And then there was a sensor in the gut that then connected via the spinal nerve, so not actually the vagus nerve, but the spinal nerves via the spinal cord to the brain, and led to dopamine release in the animals who had eaten the right thing. Dopamine release in the parts of the brain that produce reward and joy and the positive feelings. So the animals that had eaten the right diet and the microbes then process that food, they send a signal to the brain that, okay, we're in a good motivational, or we're in a good nutritional state to now really go for exercise. And that then allowed the brain to respond with reward when these animals were exercising. So not done in humans at all, very early animal work, but absolutely intriguing. And I can certainly relate to that. You know, if I eat the right stuff, my exercise is going to feel much easier, much more enjoyable than if I just had a big piece of cake and now I'm trying to run. So all of this goes to say, we're just in the process of looking at a potentially very big project to look at all these ways of communicating, looking at what happens at the metabolome, at the using multiomics, proteomics, lipidomics, the whole immune system is likely very involved in that as well. So your question is a very loaded one that probably has many layers of answers, where there is a lot of work to be done. I'm very excited to doing at least part of that work, and I think there is a lot to be learned.
Thank you.
We are out of time. Are you okay to stay for a few extra minutes to answer a few extra questions?
Sure.
So we had one on which is more harmful, insomnia or the harm of taking a sleeping pill every night?
Yeah, good question. So sleep problems, sleep fragmentation is part and parcel of Parkinson's for many, many people. Obviously, you always start with sleep hygiene. So making sure you have your regular get up times, regular sleep times, getting daylight, getting outside in the morning. So really boosting the circadian rhythm, preparing the body to get up and to sleep with light, which is a hugely powerful regulator of our circadian rhythm. Avoiding screens before bed, at least an hour, better 2 hours before bed because of the blue light emission. Having a bedtime routine, avoiding caffeine after, the afternoon, like the afternoon onwards. So many things that I think many people are aware of, but I have this conversation in the clinic often, and I'm surprised that they're still not necessarily complete awareness. I think my favorite one is to avoid sleeping too much in the daytime. So one nap up to half an hour after lunch is good, but later than that interferes with your night sleep. Really bad, falling asleep in front of the TV in the evening, because then really it's a power nap just before trying to go to bed, and then sleep is going to be disturbed. Having said all of this, so this is obviously the first layer of defense here, and that needs to be in place. But if you still can't sleep, and you're lying there awake, then it's much better to actually take something to help you sleep. And for some people, melatonin might just do the trick. For others, or herbal tea or something like that. But for others, they actually need a sleep aid. And if all these other things have failed, then I'm certainly in favor of the sleep aid, if that means that somebody can actually sleep. Because sleep is so important, and it has such an immediate effect. You know, one bad night of sleep, I know this well from being on call. The next day, I'm just simply not myself. And it has an effect. I mean, there are good studies to show that even in people who don't have Parkinson's, poor sleep, our cognitive performance drops. So sleeping well is really important. And if you don't sleep well, then go and talk to your medical team.
Thank you, Silke. One very last question here, and then we will close. The effect of H. pylori on Parkinson's patients and digestion in the brain.
A very good question. So the H. pylori is a bacterium that can live in the stomach, in the early parts of the small intestine, the duodenum, where it shouldn't be. There shouldn't be bugs there. They can come with other bacterial overgrowth of these areas of the small intestine, which is much more commonly seen in Parkinson's disease. And of course, I like this example because for the longest time we thought that stomach ulcers were, stress related, etc., until it was shown that they're actually related to a bug, H. pylori, that is. Certainly with treating. Now the issue is there was a study looking at, does bacterial overgrowth and treating bacterial overgrowth, particularly with antibiotics, so be a course of antibiotics, does treating bacterial overgrowth help off periods? And that was not successful, surprisingly. And unfortunately, the tests are not entirely straightforward. And unfortunately, also, even when treated, it often comes back. But it can lead to particularly H. pylori can, of course, lead to things like stomach ulcers as well. And so I think it is worth treating it in its own right. Whether it drives Parkinson's is still a matter of debate, but it's certainly seen much more, like there's a correlation that's more frequent in Parkinson's. This could be chicken and egg, because there is also reduced motility, gut motility in Parkinson's. If there's dysbiosis further down, this could have an upstream effect further up in the gut. So the exact how this hangs together, there's still several questions. I would treat it. Whether it's going to improve off periods hasn't really been successfully shown yet.
Thank you, Silke. That was a very insightful and wonderful overview of some of the research, as well as some of the issues that people can consider in terms of their own symptom management. So thank you very, very much. And I see Alana's responded that you are allowing us to post the recording of this presentation so that people can play it again. So thank you very much for that as well. Thanks for all you do out at the Movement Disorders Center there. We have a close partnership and rely quite heavily on you as experts in terms of facilitating the transfer of knowledge to the similar group of people across the province. So thank you, and thanks to everyone. You're most welcome. So thank you to everyone for attending. We really appreciate your ongoing support, and enjoy the rest of your weekend. Take care, everyone. Oh, I did put a note in the chat, but just remind people, if you're new to the Society or you just want to learn more about our programs and services, we have an open house about the Society coming up on May 2nd, 1 p.m. Put the registration link in there, but you can easily find it on our website under events as well. So have a great day, take care, and it was lovely seeing all of you. Bye-bye now.